It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk on a subject which, in some sense, seems far away from maturity, and yet, at the same time, it's something that we cannot possibly delay attention on. And you've laid out the reasons eloquently, and I really don't know what I can say to add to what you've already put forward. But let me try to give you an overview of why there's a strong compulsion and an imperative to look at carbon capture and storage. You very rightly mentioned the fact that there is no silver bullet. But we need to look for a few bronze bullets. We need to look at some other metals for bullets. But certainly, among all the bullets that we produce from a variety of metallic or non-metallic sources, I see carbon capture and storage as something that you really can't ignore very much longer. But what's also important is to see, as you rightly indicated, that we must bring about a coalition of industry, governments, and most importantly, the public. Because there are still several sections of society across the globe who really regard carbon capture and storage as the ultimate crime. And I think that perception has to be changed. And in order to change that perception, I think there are several steps that we need to take, because if we don't, then, as you rightly indicated, even if you get there technologically, economically, and you develop this means as a commercial and viable entity or option, we would still not be able to get very far with it. Let me just give you a broad overview of the projections of climate change to put things in context. We brought out in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC not only an assessment of the extent and nature of climate change based on past observations, but have also made projections for the future, which I think certainly provide a rationale for work in the field of CCS. Firstly, as you're aware, during the 20th century, our observations indicate that average global surface temperatures have increased by 0.74 degrees Celsius. And associated with this has been sea level rise of about 17 centimeters. We've also mentioned the fact that quite apart from these increases, there will also be an increase in the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of floods, droughts, heat waves, and extreme precipitation events. And these, incidentally, are going to take place across the globe. Of course, there are some countries which are extremely vulnerable, where the impacts undoubtedly will cause much greater devastation, both in real as well as relative terms. But basically, this is something that would affect every region of the globe. We also know that in response to the understanding of science, which I believe has moved forward at a very rapid rate in the last 2 years or so, the leaders of the G8 as well as those of the G20 have set a goal of limiting temperature increase in the future to 2 degrees Celsius. Now, we in the IPCC, in the fourth assessment report, have clearly brought out the fact that this means action on a very urgent basis. And that action involves ensuring that the global emissions of greenhouse gases must peak no later than 2015. Of course, you could allow some delay, but we must remember that if you have that kind of overshoot scenario, where let's say you go beyond this peaking in 2015, and let's say the peak takes place 3, 4, 5, or 7 years later, that doesn't rule out the possibility of your being able to stabilize the increase in global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. But the cost of doing so would be substantially higher, disproportionately higher. So it is prudent on the part of decision makers and the public at large to see that we treat this 2015 peaking period as something that really has to be respected. If we don't respect it, then we're going to make it much more difficult, far more expensive, and to some extent infeasible to do what we've set out to do, this 2-degree temperature increase limit. So therefore, we can embark on mitigation measures immediately. And I'd like to quote something from the IPCC AR4, where we've said all stabilization levels assessed can be achieved by deployment of a portfolio of technologies that are currently available or expected to be commercialized in coming decades. In other words, there is enough momentum in the system, there is enough availability of options and technologies by which we can embark on a path of stringent mitigation. But in future, that won't be enough. And there, let me quote again, the caveat that we put forward was that the prospects of new technologies would depend on what I'd like to quote. This assumes appropriate and effective incentives are in place for their development, acquisition, deployment, and diffusion. And this statement applies, if anything, more to CCS than any other form of technology. You really need a coalition